Kaelin. The scream tore through the silence of the great hall of Ironwood Estate like a blade, making royal blood stream from Alpha King Kaelin, the Iron Alpha Thorn's lips, as the silver blade found his shoulder. Elara Vance, the servant everyone believed to be mute, had shattered 8 years of silence to save the man she secretly loved. But was her cry loud enough to prevent the wolfsbane toxin, aconite, in the steel from killing him? And how did a broken Omega manage to detect the assassination that not even the fearsome Kaelin saw coming? If you loved this story of a silent servant who found her voice to save a kingdom and win the heart of a fierce king, subscribe for more epic Werewolf King romances. Hit the notification bell to never miss new stories about love that overcomes trauma, voices that can command beasts, and queens who conquer thrones through courage. Remember, sometimes our greatest strength is hidden behind what we think is our greatest weakness. The scent of melting wax and stale wine always permeated the great hall's velvet drapes, but on that winter solstice gala night, Elara sniffed something more. A discordant note hung in the air like a grim harbinger. The metallic, sweet aroma of wolfsbane toxin, aconite. Her nostrils flared involuntarily, a reflex she had learned to mask throughout 8 long years of enforced silence. 8 years. 2,920 days since her voice had been buried alongside her massacred pack. Since the night she was found trembling beneath the blood-soaked floorboards of her birth home, huddled like a wounded animal, her throat sealed by the trauma of seeing her family torn apart by savage claws. The clan physician had declared it a psychological block, that perhaps with time and care her voice might return. But time had slipped away like sand through fingers, and Elara remained the mute shadow of Ironwood Estate. To the court, she was merely a piece of furniture, an efficient, invisible servant, a broken Omega whose muteness was mistaken for mental simplicity. They spoke around her as if she were deaf too, as if the absence of words meant an absence of thought. How wrong they were. No one suspected that. Behind the perpetually lowered eyes and submissive posture resided a mind sharp as the finest blade. Throughout all those years, Elara had absorbed every secret whispered in the cold marble corridors, every plan of betrayal murmured behind seemingly closed doors, every calculated political maneuver in the shadows of power. She was the perfect spy precisely because no one believed she was truly listening, truly comprehending the complex web of intrigues that held the kingdom together by fragile threads. And above all, during those 8 years of silent observation, a secret had grown in her heart like a poisonous rose. She was lost, completely and irremediably in love with the monster everyone feared. Kaelin, the Iron Alpha Thorn, whose legendary brutality held the kingdom together through fear and respect, but whose golden eyes carried a deep exhaustion that only she seemed capable of discerning. While others saw only the alpha predator who crushed rebellions with his bare hands, Elara Vance saw the deepening lines of weariness around those eyes when he thought no one was watching. She saw how his broad shoulders sagged slightly when he was alone on his throne, as if the weight of an invisible crown was heavier than any armor. She saw the solitude that clung to him like a tangible aura, pushing away even his closest advisors. For 2 full years, she had nourished this secret passion, like a flame shielded from the wind. Twice a day, she delivered his meals, always keeping her gaze lowered, always silent, always unseen. But internally, she memorized every detail of him. The way his long fingers drummed on the arm of the throne when he was deep in thought, the solemn rumble of his rare laugh echoing through the hall like distant thunder. The way he always left a small portion of food on his plate, not from lack of appetite, but from constant distraction with the kingdom's responsibilities. On the night of the winter solstice gala, the tension in the great hall of Ironwood Estate was so thick it could be cut with a blade. It was meant to be a celebration of peace, a millennia-old tradition where all disputes were temporarily suspended in favor of harmony. The tables were draped in golden silk cloths. Silver candelabras reflected the light of hundreds of candles, and the air should have been perfumed only with exotic delicacies and rare wines. Kaelin sat on his elevated throne, an imposing figure dominating the hall with his mere presence. His muscles were evident even beneath his ceremonial robes, and the scars that marked his bare arms told a tale of 1,000 victories. But that night, there was something different in his posture. He was more rigid than usual, his golden eyes constantly sweeping the hall with a vigilance bordering on paranoia. Alara Vance had noticed this shift in recent days. Whispers of discontent had reached even her trained ears. She was serving wine at the lower tables, moving with the silent grace she had perfected over the years, when her trained gaze caught something that made her blood run cold. Silas Thorne, Kaelin's uncle and chief strategist, exchanged an almost imperceptible glance with the royal cupbearer. It was a subtle movement, quick as a blink, but Alara Vance had learned to read the palace's secret languages with the proficiency of a native translator. The cupbearer, a nervous, middle-aged man who always perspired excessively during important events, leaned slightly over Kaelin's golden goblet. A shimmering powder, almost invisible in the flickering candlelight, drifted into the royal drink like poisoned snow. Alara Vance's world decelerated, grinding to an agonizing halt. Her heart hammered like a war drum, a surge of adrenaline igniting her veins like liquid fire. The tenets of her existence had been chiseled into stone over 8 years of survival. Remain unseen, remain silent, never interfere in the affairs of one's betters. To shatter those tenets meant certain death for insubordination, not a swift, merciful end, but the kind of public execution designed to deter any other servant from defiance. But as Kaelin raised the poisoned goblet to his lips, something primordial and untamable detonated within Alara Vance's chest. The raw instinct to shield the man she secretly cherished overwhelmingly eclipsed the paralyzing dread that had been her constant companion for so long. She tried to scream. God, how she tried. Her throat constricted violently, muscles straining to tear forth a sound, but the psychological blockade remained, solid as a concrete wall. 8 years of trauma had forged an insurmountable barrier between her mind and her vocal cords. No sound escaped, only a desperate gasp lost to the hall's murmurous hum. Desperate, operating purely on primal instinct, Alara Vance shed every pretense of invisibility. She dropped the wine pitcher she carried, the metallic clatter against the stone floor resonating like a death knell, and sprinted across the great hall with a fierce resolve that startled even herself. The frantic patter of her small feet across the cold stone floor reverberated through the great hall of Ironwood Estate, severing conversations and drawing the shocked gazes of all the assembled nobility. Murmurs of surprise and outrage began to ripple outward like disturbed waters. A servant never, ever ran in the presence of royalty. It was an unthinkable sacrilege. But Alara Vance was beyond caring for protocols. She launched herself toward the elevated dais, where Kaelin's throne dominated the great hall. Not in an attack, but in a desperate last-ditch act of salvation. Her small, resolute hands collided with the golden chalice at the exact instant it brushed the king's lips. The poisoned wine arced through the air in a shimmering trajectory, splashing onto the stone floor with a sickening, wet sound. Instantly, where the liquid kissed the stone, it began to hiss and smoke, corroding the solid rock as if it were burning parchment. The potent wolfsbane toxin carved smoking holes into the floor, unleashing noxious vapors that sent the nearest nobles recoiling with guttural cries of horror. The silence that followed was more deafening than any shriek. The entire great hall seemed to freeze into a tableau of absolute shock. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were riveted on the mute servant who had dared to touch the royal drink, who had dared to shatter every imaginable protocol. Kaelin, the Iron Alpha Thorn, still not fully grasping the threat he had just averted, reacted with the brutal instinct that had kept him alive through decades of war and betrayal. His golden eyes blazed with terrible fury, and a deep growl rumbled from his throat like the roar of a wounded lion. In a move more predator than man, he clenched Alara Vance's delicate wrist with bone-crushing force. Intense pain shot through her arm, Yet Alara Vance refused to scream. She had endured worse tortures in the form of nocturnal nightmares and fragmented memories. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and in that instant of connection, she saw confusion mingled with raw fury. He failed to understand. In his mind, she had tried to poison him, not save him. But before Kaelin could utter a death sentence, true horror emerged. Silas Thorne's assassins, realizing their plan had catastrophically failed, abandoned all pretense. Like shadows gaining malevolent life, they drew silver blades that glinted ominously in the flickering candlelight. Chaos exploded in the great hall like a detonating bomb. Screams of terror mingled with the metallic rasp of drawn swords. Unarmed nobles pressed themselves against the walls, scrambling to escape the heart of the violence that had transformed a celebratory feast into a brutal battlefield. Kaelin, still gripping Alara Vance's wrist, reacted with the lethal speed that had forged his legend. He yanked her behind his gigantic body, instantly becoming a living shield between her and the surging assassins. His other hand moved to the warblade always within reach, even at ceremonial gatherings. He fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. Every movement was precise and lethal, every blow meant to kill. Blood began to drip from his blades, staining the marble floor with evidence of his necessary violence. Yet there were too many attackers, more than even the legendary Kaelin could hope to face alone. The assassins moved with professional coordination, clearly trained specifically to fell an Alpha King. Their blades were drenched in specific poisons, toxins designed to penetrate even Kaelin's superhuman resilience. They attacked in waves, forcing him into constant motion, preventing him from fully utilizing his superior strength. Amidst the frenetic battle, a blade meant for Alara Vance's heart found Kaelin's left shoulder instead. The silver tip pierced muscle and sinew with an obscene sound, like amplified tearing fabric. Royal blood, dark and rich, immediately gushed forth, spilling down his arm in crimson rivulets that dripped onto the stone floor. Warm blood splattered across Alara Vance's pale face, painting it with crimson drops that seemed like scarlet tears. The metallic tang of copper choked her nostrils, intertwined with something far more sinister, the cloyingly sweet scent of poison coursing through Kaelin's very essence. To witness Kaelin the Iron Alpha Thorn buckle, his formidable immortality momentarily pierced by the venom-laced silver, felt like watching the very sun being extinguished from the heavens. The Alpha King, who had become the gravitational core of her secretly blossoming universe, was bleeding out before her eyes, and she was utterly powerless to save him. The absolute terror of losing him dwarfed any trauma that had previously silenced her. The mere prospect of a world devoid of Kaelin, without those weary golden eyes, without that dominating presence that defined the very Ironwood estate, detonated something profound within her mind. The psychological bulwarks, meticulously constructed brick by agonizing brick over 8 years of imposed silence, simply disintegrated under the crushing weight of her utter despair. From the deepest wellspring of her soul, tearing through her atrophied vocal cords as if they were brittle parchment, a sound erupted from her throat. It was no whisper. It was no timid murmur. It was a primal, raw, agonizing shriek, laden with years of unspoken words and undeclared love. Kaelin! The sound of his own name, screamed with such desperate intensity, emanating from the Omega whom everyone in the Great Hall had believed to be permanently mute, paralyzed the entire chamber for one crucial suspended second. Even the assassins faltered, their blades dropping imperceptibly as they glanced around in disoriented confusion, desperate to identify the impossible source of that guttural cry. But that scream did more than merely alert the royal guard, who finally stormed the Great Hall, their armor clanking and swords raised. It sent a devastating shockwave through mystical connections that had long lain dormant, buried beneath years of emotional suppression and profound trauma. The fated mate bond, which had slumbered like a seed awaiting the perfect conditions to germinate, suddenly erupted, blooming with an intensity that made the very air around them pulsate with tangible, raw energy. Kaelin did not perish that night, yet the arduous road to his recovery stretched long and arduous, marked by a torment that tested the very limits of his legendary resilience. The wolfsbane toxin on the silver blade was far from ordinary. It had been specifically formulated to ravage the nervous system of werewolves, inducing violent muscular spasms and harrowing hallucinations that fragmented reality into jagged, terrifying shards. For 2 harrowing weeks, he teetered between consciousness and delirious torment, drenched in fevers that soaked through silk sheets and caused his gigantic body to convulse like a leaf caught in a gale. Alara Vance rarely left his side, spoon-feeding him when he could manage to swallow, pressing cool, damp cloths to his brow when the fever threatened to consume his very life force. A seismic shockwave rippled through the entirety of the Thorn clan's domain. News spread like wildfire. The invincible Alpha King Kaelin, the Iron Alpha. Thorn had almost been slain, saved only by the impossible intervention of a mute servant who revealed herself as his fated mate. Songs were composed of the miracle, tales spun in taverns, and speculations ran like overflowing rivers through every corner of the kingdom. Yet the fairy tale ending was dangerously distant from the brutal reality Alara Vance and Kaelin Thorn confronted. The scream that had shattered her psychological block had not magically restored her full voice. Instead, she now spoke in broken, agonizing whispers, words that emerged like crushed glass, demanding Kaelin lean closer to hear her. This raw necessity forged a forced, electrically charged intimacy between them. The Alpha King, known throughout his domain for his legendary impatience, his tendency to cut off advisors and demand immediate answers, found himself strangely calm beside her. He spent hours bent over the bed where she recuperated her own strength, listening to every whispered word, as if it were the most sacred scripture. It was during one of these intimate, hushed sessions that Kaelin made a discovery that would fundamentally alter his understanding of who Alara Vance truly was. Seeking something to distract her from the persistent ache in her raw throat, he began to examine the few personal belongings she had amassed over 8 years of servitude. Tucked beneath the thin mattress of her cramped servants' quarters, he found 3 worn, leather-bound journals. The pages were covered in delicate yet firm handwriting, filled with observations that made his breath catch entirely. These were no romantic daydreams of a starry-eyed servant. They were sophisticated military analyses, intricate political strategies, and observations on his own reign that demonstrated a level of understanding rivaling or surpassing that of his most seasoned advisors. She had mapped the shifting alliances of the nobility with a cartographer's precision, identified vulnerabilities in his defenses his own generals had missed, and proposed solutions to economic woes that had plagued him for years. One entry, in particular, left him breathless. The Alpha King is isolated by his own strength. His advisors fear him too greatly to offer honesty, and he has become an echo of his own intimidation. If he could find a voice that did not tremble in his presence, he might discover his worst decisions were made in the silence of forced adulation. The revelation that the woman he had dismissed for 8 years possessed an intellect capable of transforming his domain from its very inception was a truth that struck Kaelin, the Iron Alpha Thorn, with devastating force. He realized he was not merely safeguarding a vulnerable Omega who had serendipitously saved his life. He was unearthing a potential queen, a strategist whose formidable mind had remained concealed behind a veil of enforced silence. Yet, court politics proved to be a beast distinct from open warfare, infinitely more treacherous in its machinations. The nobility, who had grudgingly accepted Kaelin's reign through sheer brute force, now adamantly refused to acknowledge an Omega as their queen. Venomous rumors, like a creeping plague, began to seep through the marble corridors, whispers that Alara Vance had cunningly orchestrated the entire assassination attempt, allowing Kaelin to be wounded only to rescue him and secure royal favor. Others murmured of dark magic, suggesting she had ensnared the king through sorcery, for no rational alpha would ever choose a mute Omega over the daughters of high-ranking noble houses who eagerly lined up to offer powerful political alliances through marriage. These attacks were subtle, relentless, and meticulously designed to corrode trust and sow insidious discord. Elara Vance endured these relentless assaults with the same quiet dignity she had cultivated over the years, yet Kaylin watched as each malicious comment pierced her like a physical arrow. Her hands would tremble imperceptibly when she poured tea, and her nights were often tormented by nightmares that left her sleepless and vigilant until the first pale hint of dawn. But the true impediment, a shadow far more insidious than political maneuvering, was growing within Kaylin himself. A burgeoning darkness clawed at his very essence, threatening to devour not only him, but all he stood to protect. What unseen force was twisting him from within? The wolfsbane toxin on the silver blade had contained more than mere common poisons. Analyses conducted by the clan's alchemists had unveiled traces of an ancient and terrifying substance. A compound meticulously engineered to induce moon madness, a degenerative condition that irrevocably warped rational alphas into permanently irrational beasts. The symptoms began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Kaylin experienced unpredictable episodes of rage that boiled over with disproportionate fury, explosions of violence that left shattered furniture and cowering servants in their wake. His formidable capacity for concentration gradually eroded, and he found himself losing the vital threads of crucial conversations, even amidst the most pivotal clan meetings. Yet, the most terrifying manifestation was the relentless way his inner beast began to claw for permanent dominion. During the moonlit nights, a primal terror forced him to confine himself within specially reinforced chambers, for the peril of involuntary transformation had grown too immense to disregard. The sole anchor that seemed to tether him to sanity, paradoxically, was the voice of Elara Vance. Even in her shattered whispers, there was an ethereal quality in her tone that could soothe the savage beast roaring within him. When she spoke, the potent violence coursing through his veins like deadly electricity receded into a manageable tremor. This discovery spurred deeper investigations into Elara Vance's lineage, research that unveiled a startling truth. She was not a descendant of common servants, as everyone had assumed. Her origins could be traced to the Moonsingers, a subspecies of werewolves considered extinct for over 2 centuries. The Moonsingers had possessed a unique and powerful ability. Their voices had supernatural properties that could calm alpha fury, heal psychological wounds, and even influence the behavior of wild werewolves. They had been the traditional mediators in pack disputes, the healers of mental trauma, and the guardians of inner peace. Their extinction had been the result of systematic persecution. Other werewolves, fearing the power Moonsingers held over their inner beasts, had conspired to eliminate them completely. Elara Vance's family had been one of the last, hiding for generations, living as commoners to avoid detection. This revelation instantly transformed Elara Vance from a politically unacceptable mate into an incredibly valuable and dangerous resource. If she could truly control wild beasts through her voice, the military and political implications were astronomical. Silas Thorne, who escaped during the Ironwood estate attack's chaos and now hid in the Shadow Peak Mountains lair, learned of this discovery through his spy network. His strategy changed completely. He no longer wanted to kill Elara Vance. He wanted to control her, using her voice to create an army of savage alphas obeying only him. During the months following the attack, the Ironwood estate became a gilded prison for Elara Vance. Kaylin, the Iron Alpha Thorn, battling the escalating moon madness threatening to consume his rationality, made a heartbreaking decision. He tried to push Elara Vance away to protect her from himself. His fears were well-founded. During a particularly severe episode, he awoke from a violent nightmare to find claw marks on his chamber's stone walls. Had Elara Vance been present that night, he could have grievously wounded or even killed her during his altered state. The public humiliation he inflicted on Elara Vance was calculated to be devastating. During a court audience, in the presence of all the gathered nobility, he formally rejected her as his mate, declaring the bond an error caused by extreme circumstances. He called her naive and unsuitable, suggesting she had confused gratitude with true love. Each word plunged like a dagger through Alara Vance's heart. She had just discovered her voice, only to be emotionally silenced by the man she loved more than life. The tears streaming down her face were the first shed since childhood, each drop carrying years of repressed pain. But the vulnerable Omega, cowering in dark corners for 8 years, died on the blood-stained floor of the Great Hall of Ironwood Estate. In her place, a woman was born, tempered by pain and forged by necessity. Alara Vance understood true love sometimes demanded impossible sacrifices. She used her unseen network of contacts, the other servants, her only companions through years of isolation, to launch an investigation. Cooks whispered intelligence from merchants, stewards shared overheard fragments, and stable hands reported suspicious mountain road movements. Piece by piece, like a complex puzzle assembled in shadows, she uncovered Silas Thorne's lair, and crucially, information about the cure for the toxin stealing Kaelin Thorne's sanity. Her plan verged on insanity: willingly surrender to Silas Thorne, feigning betrayal of Kaelin Thorne, a strategy the Alpha King himself wouldn't know. Failure meant torture and Kaelin's moon madness. Success? The cure and vital intel on other kingdom threats. On the new moon, in deepest darkness, Alara Vance left Ironwood Estate alone. She carefully prepared her capture, leaving false clues for Silas Thorne's spies, making them believe she fled in disgrace, seeking vengeance against Kaelin Thorne. Silas Thorne's Shadow Peak Mountains lair was a nightmare. Built in natural caves, expanded and fortified, the complex was a labyrinth of torture chambers, alchemical labs, and cells holding Lycan prisoners even in bestial forms. Alara Vance was kept in a special cell, designed to contain a moon singer. Its sound-absorbing walls prevented her voice from carrying, but allowed Silas Thorne to force her abilities on captured creatures. For agonizing weeks, she was forced to use her voice to exhaustion to soothe savage beasts Silas Thorne captured for experiments. Mutilated wolves, maddened bears, and outcast Lycans, all were subjugated by her broken yet powerful voice. The torture was systematic, exquisitely cruel. Each day, her already ravaged throat was forced to perform beyond endurance, leaving her barely able to whisper by nightfall. Yet Alara Vance bore it, for every shard of suffering bought vital intelligence. She discovered that Silas Thorne had spent years perfecting the wolfsbane toxin that infected Kaelin, and that an antidote did exist, but one demanding rare ingredients and a complex process that could take weeks to complete. More critically, she learned Silas was planning a second assault on the Ironwood Estate, this time with an entire army of controlled beasts. But most importantly, she left a trail. Subtle signs only Kaelin would recognize. Markers to guide him to her, when his beast finally overcame his rational mind completely, and he came seeking her with singular determination. When Kaelin finally breached the Shadow Peak Mountains lair, guided by primal instincts that connected him to his fated mate across impossible distances, he was no longer truly himself. The moon madness had progressed to the point where his beast had seized almost total control. He was a pure predator, driven by rage, pain, and the desperate need to reclaim what was his. He tore through Silas's defenses like paper, slaughtering guards and creatures alike with a ferocity terrifying to behold. Blood painted the stone walls as he carved a path of destruction towards where Alara Vance was held, pulled forward by their fated mate bond like a magnetic compass. Silas Thorne laughed when he witnessed Kaelin's feral state. This was even better than his original plan. He would force the Alpha King to kill his own mate, a trauma that would utterly shatter him and leave the Thorne clan's domain ripe for conquest. Alara Vance was brought to a central chamber where Kaelin, recognizing nothing but threat and enemy, waited like a coiled predator. His golden eyes held no recognition, only a hunger for violence that made the very air seem to vibrate with menace. This was the moment of truth. All the suffering, all the meticulous planning, all the desperate hope had led to this singular confrontation. Alara Vance, with her raw and bleeding throat, her body a canvas of bruises and cuts, positioned herself directly before the beast who had been the love of her life. She did not call upon the mystical powers of her Moonsinger lineage, did not rely on supernatural abilities. Instead, she drew something deeper, more fundamental. With every ounce of authority she possessed as his true fated mate, as a queen who had earned her crown through blood and sacrifice, she spoke. She did not whisper. She did not plead. She commanded. "Kneel." The word exploded from her throat like a decree that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It carried all her love, all her determination, all her absolute refusal to lose him to the encroaching darkness. And the beast, at last recognizing the voice that belonged to its very soul, an authority that transcended even its own formidable alpha dominance, yielded. Kaelin, the Iron Alpha. Thorn fell to his knees before her, his massive form trembling as sanity slowly began to seep back into his molten gold eyes. The fated mate. Bond between them blazed to life like a newborn star, searing away the primal darkness that had threatened to consume him entirely. Their return to the Ironwood estate was no triumphant parade, but a hushed, arduous journey marked by profound exhaustion and the slow, arduous path to recovery. Both had been wounded, perhaps irrevocably altered by their harrowing experiences. Kaelin required weeks of meticulous treatment with the wolfsbane toxin antidote Alara had suffered so grievously to secure, while she desperately needed time to mend not only her ravaged voice, but the profound emotional trauma of their separation. During this arduous period, their roles became starkly inverted. Kaelin, profoundly weakened by the relentless healing process, demanded constant, vigilant care. Alara, despite her own lingering wounds, transformed into his unwavering guardian, feeding him when tremors rendered eating a torturous ordeal, reading to him for endless hours when the potent antidote triggered severe headaches that made even the faintest light unbearable. Slowly, excruciatingly, both began to mend. Kaelin's rationality returned in its entirety, coupled with a profound humility he had never before possessed. Having endured the sheer terror of losing control, of nearly obliterating the very essence of what he cherished most, he now approached life with a guarded caution and a newfound introspection entirely foreign to his former self. Alara's voice, her potent Moonsinger gift, gradually returned, growing stronger with each passing day as she tentatively learned to trust its power once more. But beyond her physical voice, she had unearthed an indomitable inner strength that rendered her former persona a mere pale shadow. She had not only survived unspeakable torture, orchestrated a desperate rescue, but had commanded a feral beast through sheer force of will alone. Yet, her trials were far from over. The Council, still fiercely reluctant to accept a former Omega, a mere servant, as their queen, launched a final insidious attempt to annul the sacred bond that had been formalized during Kaelin's recovery. They demanded a formal hearing, a public spectacle where Alara would be forced to justify her audacious position before the entirety of the assembled werewolf nobility. The hearing itself was meticulously orchestrated to be a profound humiliation, a strategic opportunity for the most powerful lords to vehemently assert that they would never be governed by a former servant. They meticulously prepared elaborate arguments steeped in ancient lineage, hallowed tradition, and cold political necessity. Alara Vance strode into that solemn chamber as a woman utterly transformed, a stark antithesis to the broken Omega, who had once cowered in the shadows. She wore robes of stark simplicity, which, rather than concealing, powerfully emphasized her modest origins, and when she spoke, her voice resonated with an undeniable clarity that carried effortlessly to every distant corner of the great hall of Ironwood Estate. She did not plead for acceptance or beg for understanding. Instead, she systematically exposed each council member who had conspired against Kaelin, detailing their crimes with a precision that left no room for denial. Information, painstakingly collected during 8 years of silent observation, became weaponry more potent than any blade. She unveiled Lord Aldrich's misappropriation of tax revenue, Lady Morena's treacherous correspondence with rival kingdoms, and Count Bastian's systematic poisoning of his elder brother for lands of inheritance. One by one, she shredded their credibility as thoroughly as if she had burned their ancestral estates to the ground. The blackmail was elegant, devastatingly complete. Accept her authority, or face exposure and execution for treason. The choice proved remarkably simple for those men and women who valued their lives and fortunes above mere political pride. Kaelin watched this demonstration with a fusion of awe and pride that bordered on outright adoration. His queen had forged herself in the crucible of fire, emerging as a political strategist capable of dominating courts through sheer intellect rather than brute force. When she concluded, the chamber lay silent save for the shallow, ragged breaths of the utterly cowed nobles. She had not requested their acceptance. She had demanded it through a demonstration of power more absolute than any crown could ever provide. From that day onward, the Iron Alpha and his silver-voiced queen ruled not through fear alone, but through a partnership where he was indeed her sword, yet she was his word. Kaelin provided the indomitable strength that kept enemies at bay, while Alara exercised the keen intellect that transformed threats into advantages and converted adversaries into allies. Together, they forged a kingdom where silence was no longer equated with powerlessness, where even the humblest voice could rise to command nations. The mute servant had vanished forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that her voice, when wielded with wisdom and courage, was indeed a weapon more formidable than anything in the kingdom, potent enough to tame monsters and reshape empires through the simple, unwavering force of truth, spoken without fear. If you loved this story of a silent servant who found her voice to save a kingdom and win the heart of a fierce king, subscribe for more epic Werewolf King romances. Hit the notification bell to never miss new stories about love that overcomes trauma, voices that can command beasts, and queens who conquer thrones through courage. Remember, sometimes our greatest strength is hidden behind what we think is our greatest weakness.